Welcome to I Can Unbox Anything. There are a couple of things to look at today, both of which were birthday presents. This one I bought with some money somebody gave me for my birthday. This was a present from my son. Let's open this one up first because then we get the shiny, dazzling wrapping out of the way. This is a set of identification cards for lichens, and absolutely right up my street this is. I've got an interest in nature, but I've never really known how to identify all the different lichens I see on trees and rocks and so on. And so we've got a set of cards here. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a kind of field guide available, so this is the best he could find for me. So we've got urban lichens 1 and 2. We've got churchyard lichens, specifically the kinds of lichens you're going to find on headstones in churchyards. I think we might go and test this one out this afternoon. We've got lichens on twigs. We've got lichens on heaths and moors. And rocky shore lichens. So lichens that actually grow on barnacles. How about that? Might have to look out for that next time we're at the seashore. Anyway, so that's that one. It's lichens pack, and I'm really looking forward to actually having a bit of a better appreciation of the lichens that grow in my locality. It comes with a little magnifying card, which is a little Fresnel lens that actually looks like it could be quite useful. Now, this other one, which I bought with some money that was given to me for my birthday, we'll just open that up. I'm holding it this way up because obviously there's an address on the other side. So let's just, well, that will all have to be pixelated, that bit there. Okay, so this one I bought on Etsy, and there'll be a link in the video description to the store where I bought this one from. And this is what they call what they market as a supercomputer. And it's not really a computer at all. It's just a pack of flashing LEDs. And you solder these flashing LEDs to the circuit board and then power it with 5 volts, and you switch it on and all of the LEDs start flashing. But because the flashing LEDs are not perfect and not synchronized, after a while it starts showing a pattern of kind of blinking lights that looks like some kind of complex computation is going on. Of course, nothing of the sort is actually happening. It's just flashing lights. But I like that, and so I think we'll solder that up as well. Really kind of got this mainly for a bit of soldering practice, because I've got some electronic projects in the planning, but I thought a bit of soldering practice on something like this might be quite a good idea. Now, there are no instructions. There are just LEDs and a circuit board, but it does indicate which way around the LEDs are to be soldered in. And then on the back here, we've got the little pads for ground and VCC. Okay, so we have to populate this board. Now, this board's already populated with the correct resistors for these LEDs, so I don't need to do that. It's a very neat job of all these little surface mount resistors they've got on there for those. So fortunately I don't need to do that, although I will need to be careful when I'm soldering that I don't accidentally desolder these resistors, because it's all quite a tight layout on there. So a little bit of care will be required. And I think probably the best way to do this is going to be to place an LED at each of the 3 corners first and get those flush soldered, because then the whole board will sit level on the desk. So I'll fit 3 LEDs like that, positive leg on the right for them all. And I think as long as I get that flat like that, then all of the other LEDs should mount flush. That's my theory. And then I'll do them in rows starting at this end, I think. But first, let's just get a few of those mounted. And I've obviously got to make sure that they're not... Oh, that's a horrible sound, isn't it? But yeah, I've got to make sure that they're straight when I solder them. This, by the way, is just a USB fan connected to a piece of cheap tumble dryer duct, and that will draw the fumes away from me and duct them out the window. I'm using a kind of tip that might look a little bit too big for what I'm doing today. It's a kind of chisel tip, but I found with a finer tip than this in the past that it didn't quite get enough heat onto the component quick enough. Okay, we're up to temperature. Let's see how this goes then. So, I'm probably going to have to come in from this angle because I don't want to hit those resistors. Well, that's a mess. That's possibly the worst solder joint of my entire life. So, let's try a little bit of additional flux on there and see if that helps. Wow. That's better. It's a pretty atrocious solder joint there. I don't really know why that doesn't want to go down onto that pad. Let's try again with a bit more flux. Solder just doesn't want to flow down onto the pad. Really weird. That'll do. Okay, not great, but like I say, this is actually intended. I bought this so that I could do a bit of practice soldering, so hopefully by the end of all of this I'll have something that looks a little bit more like competence. That's better. Definitely needs that extra flux. What I'm now going to do is populate this bottom row of LEDs. Positive, which is the longer leg to the right, and then we'll try and get those soldered in. And while I'm doing the soldering, let's talk about lichens. To make this video impossible for YouTube algorithm to categorize properly. If you were told the same thing at school as I was about lichens, it's that they are a collaboration. They're a kind of symbiosis of fungus and algae. But it turns out apparently that the real world's a little bit more complicated than that. And it's a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a cyanobacteria in some cases, and an alga, and in some cases yeasts, and in other cases other bacteria. And a lichen appears to be one organism, one body, but it's actually like a little community of different organisms that are collaborating in the way that they... That's not easy, that's not good. I might need to do fewer of them than that at any one time. I think as long as the LED legs are sticking up, it's going to be okay. That's not right. Maybe I should have populated from the inside out, I don't know. But some of those are quite loose, and they really have to be. What you really want is something that will hold them all in place. And I don't think a piece of tape is going to do that. So I think what I might do is drop a few of them out and see what happens if I just try and populate and then solder a few at a time. Yeah, those are staying in place better. So okay, let's go for that. Right, flux, flux, flux. Okay, getting into a little bit of a swing now. Okay, and they all look nice and flush, that's good. Solder joints getting better. I'm not going to cut the legs off just yet. We'll just leave those as they are. Maybe if I place a piece of foam underneath, that will give it the kind of additional pressure it needs to push up. Yeah, that seems to work actually. Okay, so yeah, anyway, as I say, so lichens are not the simple symbiosis of fungus and algae that you've been taught at school. I mean, it's not untrue. It's just only a fairly small part of the picture. It turns out that also people aren't very sure whether what's going on there is parasitism or commensalism or mutualism, because it kind of depends on the conditions and the mix of species or the mix of organisms in the lichen. So just to fill in a potential gap there, so commensalism is when one organism just lives on another one but doesn't really have any impact. So it might just be like those little mites that live in your eyebrows, where they're just feeding on dead skin flakes or excess sebum and don't do any harm at all. So that's commensalism. That's just kind of living on one organism, living on or in the body of another, but not really doing any damage or taking anything from it. So then there's mutualism. Mutualism is when, well, you can probably guess from the name, mutualism is when two organisms live together in a way that benefits both of them. So it was long thought that lichens were exclusively mutualistic, and so the fungus part of the organism would provide structure and protection from the elements, and the algae part of the organism would provide food from sunlight by photosynthesis. It turns out apparently that that's not always the case, and it might be that the fungus is parasitic on the algae or the cyanobacteria, or it might be that the opposite is true. It depends apparently on the conditions that they're living in and the specifics of the relationship, so the actual organisms that are involved, and a variety of other factors. So what was the other one we didn't talk about, which was parasitism. So parasitism is a type of symbiosis where one organism takes from the other and doesn't give anything back, or doesn't deliberately give anything back. And so ticks, for example, are parasitic, and fleas and things like that. They just suck the blood of their host and don't provide anything in return. But it's a form of symbiosis. Okay, well, this is getting better as I go. I think it was just a case of me being a bit rusty with the soldering. So hopefully by the end of this exercise, some of the solder joints might look presentable. So anyway, once I've done this and we've got this working, we're going to confound the YouTube algorithm by going out and identifying some lichens in my local area. Because why not? Well, not bad. A few down, many more to go. So the reason for doing it in rows like this is obviously if I was to just populate all of these, I'd never get the soldering iron in amongst the legs there. Whereas if I do it in rows like this, I will in theory be able to access all of the points I need to solder. Let's try 4 at a time now. Splash out and do something really bold and do 4 LEDs. These LEDs are flashing LEDs that flash at 0.5 Hertz, so flashing once every 2 seconds apparently. That's what I'm told. You won't know until we switch them on. Right, well, I might stop recording now because otherwise the camera's just going to overheat, but we'll be back in a moment when I've got more of these LEDs in place. Okay, I think I will actually just trim off these legs from the LEDs. I was going to leave this until the end, but I'll just double check them and make sure I've not made any stupid mistakes. Nope, only clever mistakes. I tell you what though, I'm well out of practice with soldering, because I'm finding that the solder is just climbing the legs of the LEDs. Now, I don't think it would have been a smart idea to trim them off before soldering, because that would have just made it very difficult to keep them in place. And if they then fell out, I'd have more trouble identifying which was the anode and which was the cathode. But yeah, it just amazed me how out of practice I've got with the skill of soldering. I used to do this a lot, and well, I suppose when I used to do this a lot, quite a lot of things were different. This is not like soldering to bare copper strip board. These manufactured PCBs are a kind of different material, and the solder mask they put on here, I don't know, I feel like, and I don't want to be the again the guy who blames his tools, but I feel like the pads were kind of resisting me a bit in places. I might need to come back and trim those a bit more, but we'll see. But yeah, you can see in some places, and I make no excuses for this, the solder just seemed to want to climb the legs of the LED rather than go down onto the pads. Really weird. And I was applying the heat to the leg and the pad simultaneously, but it just, the solder wanted to go up rather than down. Right, does that look any neater now? Well, kind of, but anyway, on we go. Okay, we're getting kind of close to the end now, and I've got to the point where I can do a whole row at once. Glad I started down here, because as you progress it gets really tiresome, but also because it's getting narrower as you go up, it feels like you're going faster. So I'm glad I started at the long end and worked my way up like this. Just checking as I go that I'm getting the polarity of these LEDs correct in every case before I trim the legs off as well. What I do is I solder them in, and then before I trim the legs off I just check that they all look right. Soldering, I would say I'm still in need of some practice here, because this is still proving a little bit problematic in places. It might be that I'm using slightly too large a tip and maybe slightly too small a diameter of solder, but I keep finding that the solder just doesn't want to adhere to the pad. There it goes. Yeah, again, it just doesn't seem to want to wick onto the pad. Even when I'm applying flux, it just doesn't always want to play. Interestingly, when I come back and attack it from the other side, very often that's the trick. Yeah, that one's not going either. There it goes. Ever such a cramped PCB. Whole bunch of joints there that need a revisit, but what I'll do is I'll turn around and attack them from the other side, and I'm finding that actually works reasonably well. Sometimes they don't even need additional solder, it's just it needs to be flowed a bit better. Now, of course, one of the things that happens here is sometimes the LEDs haven't gone in completely straight. So that's fairly easy to adjust, and you only really need to actually just loosen up one leg like that. Just soften the solder on that one leg there. Let's just do that one, and it can bend. That one needs to go as well. And then they can just be adjusted a little bit. I mean, probably I should melt both of the legs, but it doesn't seem to matter too much. It's just what's happening is obviously I'm repositioning one leg and bending the other ever so slightly. But I'm sure that'll be fine. Well, I'm not sure, but I think it will. I mean, the thing to remember here as well is this doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to be functional. There is, to a certain extent, a truth that pretty solder joints are the ones that will work best. You know, for certain values of pretty, solder joints that are functional are also nice and bright and tight to the pad and so on. But as with many things, it's not an absolute. Okay, last two LEDs going in now, and there are 10 spare, which is good because, you know, there might be failures or I might have messed something up. Now this flux is supposedly no clean flux, so you're not meant to need to remove it after the job, but I think I probably will. I think I'll probably test first, then I'll go back and scrub the flux off. Before I power it up, obviously I'm going to have a good look over it with a magnifying glass, just make sure I've made no solder bridges or anything like that. And oh gosh, look, those are really wonky. But yeah, this is just what I was saying earlier, so we can correct that. We just only need to melt one of the joints. And then we can can just ease that LED into place, and that one's got to go the other way. There we go. I'll just check the joints. Yeah, they're fine. Right, so there we go. That's fully populated. Some of them just need a little bit of a tweak just to neaten them up, but they're mostly in place now. So I might need a little bit of straightening up here and there, but fairly happy with that. Soldering, well, don't judge me too harshly. This is, as I say, I bought this for practice. Just spotted a few joints down here that definitely aren't right. Need a little bit more solder on them, so we'll get to those. So for powering this thing, I've got an old USB cable that I'm just going to open up and use as power. I was expecting to find a red and black cable in there, and actually I've got a pink and a blue. So I'm going to have to break out the multimeter and test which one is positive. I suspect pink will be positive, but there's no way to be absolutely sure of that other than test it. Yeah, pink is positive. Right, I actually want to trim these back a little bit, so I'm going to tin them all the way up to that insulation. And now the really tricky bit, which is going to be to tin these little pads here. They're not holes, they're just pads. So, there we go, a little bead of solder on both of those. Ground on the left, VCC on the right. Where's my cable gone? There it is. And then I should just be able to sweat these straight onto there. So, let's have a go. Okay, power is connected. Soldering iron's off. I think I probably won't power it up on the phone in case the magic smoke comes out. And I will just make sure we haven't got any wires lying down underneath. Okay, the moment of truth. So I've got one LED there that's not powering up. Just that one. And so you can see, even though they're all flashing LEDs, after they fall out of sync really quickly, because obviously they're not precisely timed. And after a while you get this very pleasing effect that looks like some kind of computation is taking place. Just going to power that down and check on that LED there then. So, oh yeah, I can see the solder's actually not, there's like a bead of solder on the end of the LED and it's not even touching the pad. That's really weird. That's one of the earlier ones, obviously. I was expecting that if we were going to have failure, it would be in the bottom end of the board, because obviously as I went along, the theory is I'm getting a bit better. Well, really doesn't want to get down on that pad. Let's try heating the pad. There we go. Yeah, I think that's it. All right, take two. And we're looking to see if that LED there lights initially. There we go. Perfect. So let's have a look at that with the studio lights off. So mind your eyes. And yep, that is a very pleasing effect. And there we go. So that's the tri-LED from Hexputer on Etsy. Link in the video description to the store. And yeah, I'm really happy with that little project. That was a bit of fun, kind of practicing my soldering. I've got a result that I'm happy with. And yeah, look at it. Doesn't it look great? It doesn't actually do anything. That's the beauty of it. So I'll just start that up again so you can see how it goes. I'm just going to leave you looking at that for a moment while I go and get ready to go and look at some lichens. Okay, so that's that. Now it's time for this. So why lichens? Why am I interested in identifying lichens? Well, I've got a bit of a thing for underdogs, and lichens, I feel, are the underdogs of the natural world. They are present everywhere. I just went out for a walk with the dog this morning, and there are lichens on this brick wall. There are lichens on this bridge. There are lichens on this tree. Actually, this tree, interestingly, has got a square trunk. I featured that in a previous video. The point is, lichens are just kind of everywhere, and because they don't really do anything that humans would classify as harm, and also they don't really do anything that humans would generally classify as useful, they're just ignored. And I think there's a potential to go and explore and find some hidden beauty here. Or if not hidden beauty, at least to exercise the skill of paying attention to things. And that seems like a useful thing to me. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to head out into the garden and the green out the front of my house and just pick up some twigs which I know have got encrusting lichens on them. There's actually a section entirely about lichens on twigs. So I'm going to collect a few twigs with lichens on them, and we'll come back and see if we can identify those. But there's also one about churchyard lichens, and I think we'll visit an old churchyard and we'll have a look at what lichens we can find there. It's a very old churchyard. Right, so here's our little collection of twigs with lichen on them. Let's try and identify what's different from other things. So we've got some yellowish green lichens here. Can't really say whether those are all the same species or not, but we'll have a look in a minute. I don't know whether that's the same as that. It looks like it probably is, actually. Now, obviously I'm not attuned to the kind of identification factors for lichens, so I've got to learn all of that to try to figure out what it is I'm looking at here. Lichens are divided. Oh, look, there's a little springtail down there. Don't know if you can see that. So yeah, apparently lichens are divided into like 4 or 5 categories, which is crustose, which is this kind of encrusting lichens, foliose, which is the leafy lobe-shaped ones, fruticose, which I think is branching, and leprose, which is kind of powdery. So anyway, let's have a look and see what we can figure out here. So keys to lichens on twigs. Well, I'm looking at something that's kind of yellowish green. It's kind of lime green with little yellow cups on it. That looks like it's the closest I've got here. So Xanthoria parietina, or possibly Xanthoria polycarpa. Lobes are broad and spreading in the first one, and narrow, more or less upright in compact cushions in the other. Right, so this is, I believe, Xanthoria parietina. I think that probably is the case with all these others here as well, although it's hard to say. Yeah, I got some learning to do here, but that's good. So that's that one. Now next we've got this kind of greyish green thing here, and I'm not sure these are all the same, but it's a kind of got little antler type feathery branched fingers on the ends of the lobes. So, well, tempting to say it's these, but those look a little bit more rounded and fleshy than what I'm looking at here. So here we are. So I think it's this one here, Fischia or Physia tenella. Margins of lobes fringed with whisker-like cilia, fruits rare, soradia on lower surface of lip-like lobe ends. I don't even know what soradia is, so got to learn a bit of terminology there as well. Really kind of out of my depth here. And that's an oddly nice feeling. And then I think the third species we've got is this one here, which might just be, no, I don't think it is a more mature version of that. There were some branches out there that had this attached to them, but they were too big to fit in my tray. So that's a kind of smallish piece of it that's obviously fallen off a twig. And the ends of the little branches here are cup-like, or cupped mushroom shapes. So what are we looking at here? I think it might be just a more mature version of this. Actually, I think it might be this Physia ascendens or Physia tenella. except it says fruits rare, and I think those little cup-shaped things at the ends of the branches are the fruits. So, well, this is harder than I thought it would be. Now, if there's any lichen experts watching this video, and hopefully not tearing your hair out in frustration at watching my inept attempts to identify these lichens, then do let me know in the comments if you can identify any of these and can help me with them. And especially if you can identify them, let me know what it was that you did. I need to kind of absorb the process here. What it was that you recognized in these specimens that enables a clear identification, because that's what I'm trying to get to. So also we've got down here tiny little flattened things with what looks like circular bumps, circular dark regions on them. I don't know if you'll be able to see that there. I'll get a close-up. Well, actually no. I'll get a close-up with the camera, but meanwhile I can look at it with this little lens, which is actually very useful. So this one, so I think what we've got there is Amandinea punctata, crust with pale margin, fruits black, disc-like. Yeah, I think that's what that is. So that's got a pale margin, and the fruits are indeed disc-like. So I think that might be my first very conclusive identification. So looking closer at this yellowish green, actually foliose lichen, because when you look really closely, it is little lobes and leaf-like structures. I think we are looking at Xanthoria parietina. I did also notice that one of the lichens I spotted while I was out, growing on a planter next to the petrol station, was almost certainly this one, which is actually the same lichen. So Xanthoria parietina grows on, well, it says trees and wood, but actually let's have a look and see if it's on, yeah, so it grows on stone as well. So a lot of these things appear more than once in this key, but that's fine because this is context related. Anyway, that's probably enough of that. I'm going to go and release all these little critters back into the outdoors, these little bugs and things that are crawling around in here, and put these twigs back more or less where I found them. And then let's head out to the churchyard and see what we can find there. See if we can find anything different or interesting there. So we're visiting today the site of a, I think, 14th century church. Oh look, lichens down there. Anyway, that's not what we're here to see. There was a church on this site. This was the Otterbourne Church. Let's have a look. Yeah, the Church of St Matthew in Otterbourne. And it was finally demolished in 1971. It actually moved from this location to Otterbourne about a mile or so over that way in the 1800s when the railway came through. Just beyond that line of trees there, a new railway line came through, and the people of the little village here decided it was going to be too noisy, and so they moved the whole village, including the church and a few houses. They moved the whole village a mile or so that way to the main road. The chapel remained in use as a chapel for funerals because the burial site continued to be used for a few years beyond, probably because of family plots and the like, and then eventually fell into disrepair and was demolished, with the last little bit which was demolished in the 1970s. We'll have a look around the site and then we'll have a look at some of the lichens we can find growing on the headstones. And that was the train track that you just heard there. That was a train passing on the track that you just heard. Okay, well, I imagine that path must join up with the Itchen Way. So just down here actually you can see the remains of tiles and bricks and so on. That will have been demolition pieces from the old church building, piece of slate there, presumably from the roof. It is a bit of a shame when things come to an end, but it is the way things go. So actually here you can see the outline of where the old chapel would have been. I think this bit here was the nave. There's a fascinating document actually, which I'll link to in the video description, about an archaeological excavation on this site, which has got lots of the history and documentation about the reason for moving it and so on. It's a really interesting read actually. I'll link to it in the description. Okay, so here we've got some really old headstones. I don't know if the writing on them is even still legible. It's either worn away or disappeared under a crust of lichens. Let's find somewhere I can actually sit down. Okay, so here's one that we can try and identify. So I'm going to get the key out and have a look. So we've got a greyish sort of thing here, greyish brown patch, and again here these are all separate individual organisms. I think we've got these whitish ones and the yellowish ones. So it seems fairly clear that these circular white patches here are Catoplaca taecolita. Interestingly, underlining the underdog status of lichens, none of these lichens have got common names. They're all only known by their scientific names. Anyway, so I'll get a close-up picture of that one. And then this yellowish one, let's have a look at that. That's, I think it's this one here, Catoplaca citrina. I think so. Although it actually might be flavescens there. Catoplaca flavescens. This is harder than I thought it would be. And I think a lot of that is because I'm completely unfamiliar with what I'm looking at here. Anyway, a bit more of a wander round. So I'm walking on what was the foundations of the old church. And you can see iron railings there. The burials here continued quite a long time after the church was decommissioned, and probably because of family plots and things. And so those iron railings over there and here will probably have delineated a family plot. What's nice, I think, is it's now pretty much a little nature reserve. So I imagine they probably come in here and cut the grass once a year or so, and it stays as a kind of meadow with lots of wildflowers. I can hear grasshoppers. I can see that the site is visited by rabbits. And it's interesting that the different sides of the headstones have got quite different specimens on them. That will be a lot to do with the prevailing conditions. So I think even this here is a leprose lichen here. Just thinking, this dark coloured one here ought to be fairly easy to identify, didn't it? There aren't that many dark coloured ones. Let's have a look in the pack. So it's either Verrucaria nigricans or Placyntium nigrum, and that's it. It's got to be one of those two, really. So I think let's have a look at it close up. Might have to get the lens out for this. Really hard to say. But it's interesting, you might think that these dark spots are just the stone showing through, but they're not. This is actually a different species of lichen right here. I think that is Placyntium nigrum. No. Placyntium nigrum, I think. But really don't feel like I'm doing very well with the identification here. This one, I'm sure, is this Catoplaca flavescens. And this is interesting on the top here, although I think that is a moss. Mosses will be another day. I think that one there is Hematoma ochroleucum. This one here I think is Catoplaca citrina. This kind of one that's mottled all over here. Yeah, you really have to look very close to actually see the necessary details. That's a very ornate headstone there, look. The name on it is not really completely readable. Well, this certainly is the right place to find lichens that have been growing for centuries, but clearly I got some more work to do on the identification skills. That was a little bit harder than I thought, but it's given me an idea and it's given me a little bit of a taste for what it is I need to be looking at, maybe thinking about when I'm trying to identify these lichens. Not very much more than kind of a little dip of the toe into the whole realm of lichens. I'm very interested to hear from anybody in the comments who can give me some advice on the kinds of things I'm looking for, on how I might best acquire this skill. Anyway, let's head back to Atomic Shrimp HQ now for a little bit of reflection on what we've learned today. So, a little bit of reflection now. What have I learned from these two apparently quite disparate things, lichens and electronics? Although having said that, electronic lichen could be the name of this channel. What I found particularly enjoyable about these two things is that they were beyond me in a very mundane way. So I've done soldering before, I've done electronics before, but not for a very long time. So soldering 382 solder joints on here was not only something that had an end result in mind, but it was also good practice. As I say, it's been a very long time since I did any amount of serious soldering, and everything's changed since I last did it. So these modern PCBs with very small tracks, very small pads, solder mask, and so on, I'm kind of accustomed to soldering on strip board, on bare copper strip board. So it's just good to get a little bit of practice in on that. I think I've still got a way to go. And on the lichen, similarly, it was actually just quite nice to be out of my depth. I think that's probably what was most enjoyable about this, is the contrast of being completely out of my depth and at the same time being completely safe. This carries a risk of me getting it wrong, but at the same time, getting it wrong has no serious consequence. I found that really enjoyable, and I'm looking forward to trying to get a little bit better at identifying lichens and just noticing them, to be honest. So I hope this very disparate pair of things has been interesting in some way or other. I certainly enjoyed all of it. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.